Hey, are you tired of the left and right politics? I hope you'll subscribe to my YouTube channel. Just click that subscribe button, ring the little bell, and prepare to free your mind from the traditional red versus blue. I'm sure that this national audience knows that Ed Rendell was the governor of Pennsylvania. I'll bet this national audience knows that Ed Rendell was once the head of the Democratic National Committee. I suspect that this sophisticated national audience knows that Ed Rendell was also the mayor of the city of Philadelphia. But are you aware of the fact that Ed Rendell was a two-term district attorney in Philadelphia? It's true. He served in that role from 1978 through 1985. And the governor, the mayor, the DA, the chair joins me now. Hey, Governor, it's great to have you back. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Michael. And by the way, I was also an assistant district attorney for 7 years in Philadelphia.
Well, I love the story. I love the story. You correct me if I'm wrong. You went to your boss, Arlen Specter, and told him what?
I told him I was going to leave the office and get into politics. And he said, well, good, I'll call Billy Meehan, who was the Republican chair. And I said, well, Arlen, don't call Billy Meehan, I'm a Democrat. Arlen was a Republican, but he never asked us what our political registration was.
Things have changed. So, Gov, I am holding in my hand, I don't know if you can see this, I printed it from the internet. It is an Ed Rendell for District Attorney brochure circa 1977. And
Right.
I see that your slogan at the time was, it's a matter of integrity. And I'm curious to know, did you run for office for DA promising to lock up the bad guys and throw away the key?
Well, I did two thrusts to my campaign. One was that the office under the man I ran against had become a guilty plea mill, where they just took guilty pleas for pathetically low sentences on murderers, on people who committed forcible rape, on people who used guns to assault people. So the weakness of the DA's office was one of the things I ran against, and also the corruption. He had refused to prosecute police. He had refused to prosecute politicians. The office was for sale. If you were a lawyer of any influence, you got your case dismissed. So I ran on integrity and the leniency of the office itself.
The reason I asked the question is that on CNN on Saturday, I played a campaign commercial from, I guess Lynn was your successor, from District Attorney Lynn Abraham, who in Philadelphia, Frank Rizzo called her a tough cookie. She embraced it. And Gov, she ran a commercial where the New York Times had referred to her as the nation's deadliest DA. I'm sure they didn't mean it as a compliment, but she put that in her commercial. And what I was trying to explain to people is that's the way you used to get elected prosecutor, by thumping your chest and saying that you were going to be hard on crime. Things have really changed. You'd agree?
Yeah, there's no question. And they've changed for a reason, Michael. And the reason was the justice system, starting with the police and going through the courts, has really need shaking up. It need changes. It became too oriented to just throwing people in jail and locking up the key. Just like we did in the 90s with the people who were addicted to crack cocaine. The federal courts threw them in jail, and they weren't criminals, they were victims themselves. So there were abuses in the system, which spawned this new group of prosecutors saying that they were going to go in and clean up some of the abuses. And that was true with our DA, Mr. Krasner. And Mr. Krasner isn't a bad man, but he has absolutely forgotten what is the single most important part of his job. And that's protecting people from violent crime, making sure that people who commit violent crime are put in jail for a period of time that will ensure the safety of the community. He said that enforcement is a small part of the story. And what the DA should concentrate on is improving the education system, is removing poverty, And in the cosmic sense, he's right. Crime is caused by bad education, by lacking in economic opportunity, by poor housing. Those are all the things that promote crime. But that's the job, primarily, that's the job of a governor, a mayor, a president, a legislator, a congressman. It's not the primary job of the DA. Mr. Krasner has forgotten that the primary job of the DA is to enforce the laws, and when they should be enforced against people who are violent and dangerous, those people should be put in jail for as significant a period as possible to protect the law-abiding citizens of the city. And he's created this myth that African-American, Latino, and poor whites are the victims of this justice system. Well, they are the victims because they're the victims of violent crime. And what's happened is the victim in the justice system under Mr. Krasner gets no consideration. They don't even notify the victims when the defendant's being sentenced. All of the attention is on the defendant. And as I said, Mr. Krasner says enforcement is a small part of the problem. He's wrong. Enforcement is the story. It's the most important thing we can be doing. And he doesn't understand that, or he refuses to recognize it. And you know, in Philadelphia, like most of the nation, but we have it worse than most of the nation, we've had an explosion of gun violence, of not only homicide by guns, shootings with guns, assaults with guns, robberies with guns, and people carry loaded weapons on the streets of Philadelphia with impunity. The police chief says no one worries about being caught with a loaded gun because they don't see any consequences in the system itself. And he has, Mr. Krasner has dismissed or have withdrawn almost 70% of the total gun cases that have come into the city in the last half year. We can't go on like that. We've got to put a stop to it. And in Carlos Vega, his opponent, who happens to be Latino, who happens to have grown up poor, first generation college, Mr. Vega understands that the job of the DA, first and foremost, is to protect the citizens from violent crime. Secondly, the DA should try to make the system fairer. And Mr. Vega understands that. He says we can't incarcerate our way out of the problem. And he's right. If we want to do something about crime in America, we have to go at those long-term root causes. But we can't neglect the most immediate thing that calls for action, and that's a system that will protect our citizens from violent crime. You know, let me tell you one little vignette, because I know you love vignettes. When I was an assistant DA, I became an assistant DA right out of law school. At my first law school reunion, my classmates said, "How can you stand your job? All you do is put poor people in jail." And I said, "Guys, you couldn't be more wrong. The people who I represent are the victims of crime, and they are the poorest members of our society. They are African American, they are Latino, they are Asian American. They're the people in most cases who've never had anybody speak for them. When I'm in court representing the victim, trying to get justice, I'm the first champion they've ever had. I feel great about what I do because I'm giving them hope and I'm trying to protect them with what I do." I meant that as a 24-year-old assistant DA, and I mean it today as a veteran in my 70s. It's just as important.
You're so uniquely qualified to be here and to explain to this audience what's going on using Philadelphia as the local example. As you, oh, and by the way, here's the headline from the Inquirer: 7 people killed, 18 injured last weekend alone in Philadelphia. But as you know, Gov, it's Krasner is the highest profile. He's now up for re-election. The Tuesday primary will determine whether he returns to office. But in San Francisco, it's Chesa Boudin. In Los Angeles, it's George Gascon. In Baltimore, the state's attorney is Marilyn Mosby. There have been a number of progressive prosecutors who've been elected, many, I should say, with George Soros's support. And I know that the right likes to portray him as the boogeyman and behind all of these conspiracies and so forth. In this case, it happens to be true that he has decided he was going to open his checkbook to support Krasner and others. Do you agree with me that this is really the Tuesday election, a test case for whether the public will continue to go down this road?
Yeah, I think it is a test case. And again, let me stress that a lot of things that Mr. Krasner has talked about and those other DAs have talked about are needed change to the criminal justice system. Let me just give you one example, cash bail. In Philadelphia, if you commit any sort of a crime, if you're put on bail, and most defendants are, you have to put up cash bail. So let's say the judge says you're held in $5,000 bail. You have to put up approximately $500. Now, you may be in jail for an offense that you'll never be sentenced to. Let's assume you're a first-time offender and it was, you stole some food from a supermarket. You're never going to be sentenced to jail for that as a first-time offender in Philadelphia. But if you can't put up the bail because your family doesn't have $500, you could stay in jail for a year before your trial. Whereas someone who's got money just puts up the bail the next day and never does any time in jail at all. That had to be changed. And some of these progressive prosecutors are making changes like that. But the answer is you can do both. You can create a balance. When I became DA, you'll remember this, Michael, I was the first one to put in a victims unit to take care of victims, just their problems. Secondly, I created a rape unit because I didn't think people charged with sexual assault, I didn't think the victims were getting the right support during the trial. Then I created a police misconduct unit, and we tried policemen for excessive use of force. You'll remember when I arrested the police who beat up Delaware, Africa, I had almost 1,000 police in the lobby of our building yelling slogans about taking, I wear blue, take me too, and holding up negative signs about me. I can do both as a district attorney, and you should do both. They should continue to be advocates for the things they're talking about, but they should understand that victims come first, that the victims are as poor and as lacking in opportunity and fearful as anybody in the city. And that's their immediate number one job. That's not just a small part of the story, as Mr. Krasner says, it is the story.
So you've embraced Carlos Vega, a prosecutor who was fired among 20 or 30 who were fired by Krasner when he first came into office. The progressive community, the most progressive of Philadelphia's partisans, are for Krasner. Here's another headline that I'm looking at, which says, Philly cops are going all out to defeat DA Larry Krasner. Now let me tap into your political expertise, former chair of the DNC, among other things. This is a really difficult race to prognosticate, especially when so few people comparatively will turn out and make the decision. How do you see it?
Well, first of all, let me say one of the reasons I'm supporting Mr. Vega is I have confidence in him too, because believe it or not, Michael, 35 years ago, I hired Carlos Vega out of Boston University Law School to be an assistant DA. And I have a high regard for him personally too. I think he will create that right balance. It's tough to beat an incumbent in Philadelphia, particularly in a race like this, which is low turnout, where there is relatively little money spent. I mean, if the two candidates together spend $2 million, that'll be a lot. For a mayor's election in Philadelphia, the two candidates will spend $15, $17 million. So you're right, there's a big advantage towards an incumbent because of the low turnout. But Mr. Krasner doesn't have to lose to make the point that people are worried, people want change. It's easy for a DA to get reelected. When I ran for my second term as DA, I got 81% of the vote in a general election, 81% of the vote. I didn't have an opponent in the primary. If Mr. Krasner wins, he won't get anywhere near 81% of the vote. He won't get anywhere near 70% of the vote. My guess is he won't even be in the 60s. If he wins, I think he'll win by 10 points, 55-45, something like that. And if Mr. Vega had raised more money, I think Mr. Vega would have won. And he still might win. Still might win, because people are afraid. People are afraid. And they read March 3rd, just a little more than a month ago, one of Mr. Krasner's assistant DAs goes into court and tells the judge he wants to let a defendant who was charged with 3 separate gunpoint robberies. Gunpoint robberies. He wants to let that defendant plead for a concurrent sentence of 11 and a half months. 11 and a half months for 3 gunpoint robberies. When someone commits 3 gunpoint robberies, you can bet your right arm that eventually that person is going to continue to commit gunpoint robberies if he's out on the street. You can bet your right arm that during one of those robberies, the defendant's going to try to resist, and then the victim's going to try to resist, and the defendant will take his gun out and shoot and kill that victim.
And the cops are upset because even in the killing of a police officer, Krasner won't seek a death sentence, even though you and I know in Pennsylvania it's on the books, but we really don't mean it.
Yeah, it's on the books. It hasn't been enforced by the courts, actually. It hasn't been enforced for 30, 35 years. Look, if there's any case that deserves the death penalty, and you can debate the death penalty, I am for it, but for the very infrequent use of it. But if there's any case that warrants the death penalty, it's killing a police officer. The Mia Abdul Jamal case, celebrated case all over the world. Mumia, guilty of sin. What he did to make up for he thought the police beat up and arrested his brother unfairly and incorrectly. He walks up to an officer sitting in a patrol car and essentially pulls out his gun and shoots the officer. The officer pulls out his gun and shoots and wounds Mumia. Mumia returns fire and hits the officer a second and a third time and kills him. A premeditated murder case. That it became a rallying cry for progressives all over the world. When I was mayor, I was the DA at the time when Mia was prosecuted. When I was mayor, I was visited by Ed Asner. I was visited by Madame Pompidou, the wife of the French president. When I gave a speech at the Kennedy Center in Boston, Mumia protesters interrupted my speech, and they never read the transcript. They never read the evidence against Mumia, which was overwhelming. So yeah, I think if there is a death penalty, if it's on the books, it should be used for shooting a policeman who's trying to protect people in the line of duty.
Well, I embrace what you've just said. As a matter of fact, I read a well-documented book called Murdered by Mumia on exactly that subject. Hey, Governor, that was a great primer as to what's at stake in Philadelphia, but what it also means for prosecutors and citizens across the country. And as I say, you were uniquely qualified to offer it. Rendell for DA. It's a matter of integrity. Thank you, Governor. I really appreciate it, and I hope I see you soon.
Well, thanks, Michael. But it's important for your audience to remember, you can be progressive as all get out, but you can also understand that your first job is protecting people from violence.